Senior Research Fellow at the Akrofi-Christaller Institute of Theology, Mission and Culture in Ghana. He's the director of the Gillian Bediako Center for Primal and Christian Spirituality, and he's editor of the Journal of African Christian Thought. He holds an MA and a PhD in theology, both from the Akrofi-Christaller Institute. He also studied at the University of Tennessee, Knoxville, where he received a bachelor's in finance and an MA in modern European history. His research and writing interests include primal indigenous spirituality, Christian history, missions, theology and arts, and Black American Christianity. Please join me in welcoming our dear brother and colleague, Dr. Joshua Settles.
Thank you very much. And at the risk of being self-promoting, I'm grateful also for the opportunity to say that my first book is also published, and it's on the table, and it's about Black American Christianity, manifesting the primal imagination. Amen. Now I've stood here, I feel shy because I see my former rector is directly in front of me, but let me continue anyway. As director for the Gillian Mary Bediako Center for Primal and Christian Spirituality, permit me to express my heartfelt gratitude to the family of the late Leonora Arasi Glover and to the faculty and staff of the School of Performing Arts, and especially to the acting dean, Prof. Asiedu. Thank you for your warm welcome. Thank you for your hospitality. My thanks also to Dr. Darko for your wonderful devotional. I didn't know we would be singing today. I left my singing voice at home. To the moderators for today, Dr. Sarah Dogbaji, Dr. Ingrid Walls. Dr. Walls happened to be one of my PhD supervisors, and Sarah has been the liaison from the School of Performing Arts and Akrofi-Christaller in this endeavor. So thank you both very much. Shall we put our hands together for them? I've already mentioned our former rector of ACI, Prof. B.Y. Kwashi, who is here, and I see also and want to acknowledge the presence of the rector of Akrofi-Christaller, Reverend Professor Philip Laye. Shall we put our hands together for them? Dear colleagues, ladies and gentlemen, the chosen theme for this year's symposium is engaging the arts in popular culture. This is the 5th year of the symposium, the 4th held under the current name and in collaboration with the University of Ghana School of Performing Arts. As I began preparing for this symposium and the assignment given me, and the team can testify that I did not necessarily want to be the one giving the plenary, but I debated what to share to set the tone for our discussions. It occurred to me that what was needed is a larger framework, or perhaps a larger canvas, or a bigger stage in which to place our ongoing conversation. To do this, it is appropriate to review our journey thus far before coming to the key issue I wish to address, which, if you are looking for a title, is The Art of Theology and the Theology of Art, Reflections on Christian Creativity. The genesis of this symposium may be traced to a faculty lecture I delivered at Akrofi-Christaller Institute in 2020, titled The Arts, Theology, and the Primal Imagination in the African Context, a preliminary exploration of their relationship. Drawing on my childhood interest in architecture and my PhD research related to embodied theology in Black Pentecostalism, that lecture was intended to be a, quote, preliminary foray that I hoped would stimulate further lines of thought and inquiry. The interest of Professor Philip Laye, who was then Dean of Accredited Studies for ACI, was piqued. He accosted me after the lecture, as it evoked his own interest in the relationship between Christianity and Culture. There was a youthful spark of joy in his eyes. It was evident as he seized on the questions raised in the lecture, and he encouraged us. You know, when your dean encourages you, he encouraged us to take the conversation further, which we did in the following year in our first symposium, as the dean has acknowledged, under the theme Christian Faith and the Arts in Africa, Bridging the Cultural Divide. Since then, each year we have brought together scholars, pastors, and artists for substantive conversations on the relationship between Christian thought and the arts in a way that, to my knowledge, is not being replicated anywhere else on the African continent within the context of a public university and a private Christian theological institute. This is the doing of the Lord, and it is marvelous in our eyes. Yet for all the richness of the conversation in which we have been engaged, for all the progress that has been made in bringing these issues to the fore, it remains the case that the issues we are engaging are challenging, fraught with difficulty and danger. This is because what we are discussing are issues that cut close to our hearts and to our sources of meaning and identity. Any artist and any theologian worthy of the name will bear witness that artistic creation, as well as theological reflection, are intensely personal matters. Try as we might, and as we must as academics, neither an artist nor a theologian can stand entirely apart from his work, because we are dealing with our own souls. And here I quote from a young man, Prince Borti. We'll hear from him later in the symposium. In a discussion with me on the 15th of April of this year, in preparation for the symposium, he had this to say: being an artist is an identity. It is who you are, like being a Ga or an Akan. It doesn't matter how long you've been away from it. It will always be there. It is part of you. Prince spoke in specific relation to art, but his statement has broader implications. For those of us who are Christians, whether artists, theologians, pastors, performers, or some combination of these, the conversation in which we are engaged is not merely a theoretical or academic discussion. It is personal. However, this personal element is not the only reason why this discourse is challenging. The conversation is fraught with difficulty because of the ways in which the arts, especially in popular culture, and the practice of Christian faith seem to belong to separate spheres of life. And so those of us who are engaged in both, or who are even engaged in conversation about how they might be brought together, find ourselves in an unusual space. It feels at times that we are trying to join together what the church and the academy and the culture insist must be kept asunder. I recall a conversation I held with a young man last year, a graduate of the University of Ghana School of Performing Arts, and a Christian. And I asked him in this conversation, I didn't tell him I was a pastor because I wanted his honest answer. So pastors, take note. You don't always have to tell people you are a pastor. I asked him what his Christian faith had to do with his work as an artist. His straightforward answer, given without a moment's hesitation, was nothing. For him, being a good actor had nothing to do with being a good Christian. And indeed, as the conversation progressed, it became clear that in his view, being a good Christian might even be a hindrance to being a good artist. Now, it may seem to some that his response reflects an immature or inadequate understanding of the Christian faith, and there may be some truth to that. But there is truth too in what he said. at least so far as what being a serious Christian means in our context. In our conversation, he mentioned that to be a good actor meant being willing to go beyond the boundaries of what many Christians consider to be appropriate, to break convention, to delve into places of danger, spiritual danger, that would call into question the integrity of his faith. For him to really be devoted to his craft, he would have to break with the conventions of Christianity as he understood it. I challenge this, as a good pastor would do, arguing that not only are there many great artists and actors who are Christians, some of whom are among us, but that being a great artist or an actor requires authenticity. And one's core identity as a believer in Jesus Christ is and must be inseparable from one's artistic expression. We do not cease to be Christian when we mount the stage or sit behind the keyboard or take up the pen of a ready writer. This brings me directly to my topic. For the difficulty in the case of this young man, and in many cases like this, relates to an inadequate or even non-existent theology of art. Robin Phillips, a US-based commenter notes, if a Christian, listen carefully, if a Christian feels a vocation to be a missionary, there is a complex body of thought and tradition to help him navigate his self-understanding. By contrast, there is comparatively little support and understanding for those who have been called to pursue the arts, whether full-time or just as a hobby. What Phillips says in the US context is amplified in the African Christian setting, where not only have the arts traditionally been associated with religious beliefs and practices that Christians condemn, but a pragmatic drive for economic development in a competitive economic environment overrides every other concern. Many here in the School of Performing Arts can testify the pressure brought to bear on the academy to justify why artistic pursuits are valuable in a monetary sense, or why scarce resources should be expended on something that may not generate income. Christians too are not exempted from these concerns, and indeed may even be more susceptible to them due to our context, because of the overemphasis on prosperity, material prosperity, which usually means wealth accumulation and conspicuous consumption. Recently, I read where one well-known pastor, I will not mention his name, argued that musicians should not seek to be compensated for serving in church. Hey, let the church say amen. While I appreciate his concern for serving for those who treat music ministry as a mercenary enterprise, I do not recall ever hearing a pastor say that preachers should shun compensation for their service in church. In any case, that is a multifaceted conversation for another day. Perhaps over the tea break, we can discuss it further. The more important point is that our collective theological imagination is frequently subordinated to the consumerist mindset that says, how will this help me fetch money? With no further thought as to the good, the true, and the beautiful, which is what the church is supposedly devoted to. Theology of arts. Theology of arts begins from the premise that God is the first and greatest artist. Or to put it in contemporary language for the Gen Z, God is the original content creator. This is the first point. From a biblical perspective, the first thing revealed about God found in Genesis 1:1, God creates. This understanding of God is found not only in the Bible, but throughout most primal cultures, as indeed is in Ghana, where one name for God among the Akan peoples, for example, is Obwadie, the creator. Creation is said to have been done ex nihilo. Ex nihilo. That is, out of nothing. A phrase that I find to be somewhat misleading because it suggests the existence of an empty space existing at some point in time, when in fact both time and space are themselves creations of God. That is to say, there was a time and space when even time and space did not exist. The text of Genesis suggests that in the immediate aftermath of creation, the heavens and the earth are both formless and void. The creation is enacted through speech, which suggests to me that creation is something less like the making of a carving or the painting of a picture, and something more akin to the work of a conjurer who causes something to appear suddenly that was not there before. The book of John later terms this divine speech the Word, that is, the Logos, which was God and was with God, and associated with the man Jesus Christ. The Greek term logos is an abstract conceptualization of what is demonstrated in the Genesis narrative. That is, that creation is rational, orderly, and logically apprehensible. Order is conjured out of nothingness and stands in opposition to chaos, which perpetually threatens to undermine it. Chaos, symbolized by the primordial seas in the Genesis account, may also be called disorder, and it is not eliminated from the creation. It is instead bounded and delineated carefully. The demarcation of times and seasons, the fixing of the firmament above and below, the bounding of the seas by the land. These are all ways by which chaos or uncreation, or perhaps entropy, to use our scientific terminologies, are kept at bay. Astute Bible readers will note that the sea, the primordial symbol of chaos that churns, destroys, and threatens just beyond the boundaries of the ordered creation, is only eliminated entirely in the Revelation account of the new heavens and the new earth. These boundaries become the framework for the artwork of creation, or perhaps the borders of the stage upon which the drama of creation unfold. This boundedness is significant, for it suggests to me that boundaries are an essential feature of creation and thus of art. And I shall return to this in due course. The Creator brings into the frame or onto the stage creativity and diversity in abundance, which add to our own sense of beauty in the world. Diversity of forms, differentiation of various kinds, including sex differences, contrasting and complementary colors, textures, rhythms, and themes. The very things that we recognize as being fundamental to the creation of art are interwoven into the fabric of creational reality. Into this creation, the final art piece is cast. God makes man in his image. Adam, the living icon of God, cast from a mold of clay and inbreathed with divine breath. Made alive by the breath of God, man is placed in a garden. And a garden is a bounded space for the expression of human creativity planted eastward in Eden by God's own hand. Man, by which I mean male and female humanity, is differentiated from the rest of creation by virtue of being made in the image of God, in God's image and likeness. The writer Andy Crouch notes that at no point before the creation of mankind has there been any sense that the created world bears a resemblance to the Creator. The creation and the creatures are all said to be good, but it is man alone who is made in the imago Dei. Image and likeness are ambiguous terms. It's not quite clear what this imago Dei entails. Yet, what is most clearly seen in the passage by this point, all that we know about God, is God's purposeful and energetic desire to create. That is the only thing we know about God. And then it says that man is made in the image of this God who purposely and energetically creates. That is to say that whatever else God may be, God is a creator. And thus, humanity, by implication, has an innate edge to create as well. And this is the second point in my theology of art. For as a creature made in the image of God, mankind is an artist. Art making is an intrinsic part of being human. And I note, too, the communal and relational element in all of this. Man is made in the image of God, and God self-referentially uses the plural form. That is, God is a singular being that is simultaneously a community of persons who relate to one another in love and self-giving. Further, every element of creation exists in relation to every other element in an interdependent way. This relational interdependence is supremely reflected in the creation of man as one, yet sexually differentiated, interdependent creature as male and female. The second creation account in Genesis 2 draws this out more fully, where God says, "It is not good for the man to be alone." And so a suitable help, a compatible partner is made for him, a woman, and they together express the image of God. A theology of art thus tells us that human creativity most fully reflects God's creativity when it emerges from a lively, loving community of persons. Before moving on to discuss the art of theology, a lot more could be said about the theology of art if there was time, but there's one important element I want to expatiate upon briefly. I proposed earlier that boundaries are an essential feature of creation and thus of art. This is important and cannot be bypassed. God's placement of man in the garden with a mandate to dress and keep reinforces this idea. For the garden is a kind of playground for human flourishing and creativity, yet it is one whose enjoyment hinges upon the maintenance of a very important boundary set by God. Do not eat of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. The English writer G.K. Chesterton talks about the recurrence of this motif in human folklore. That is the idea of a transgression that undoes the magic and brings disaster. You may think of the story of Pandora's box or Icarus, who flew too close to the sun and thus lost his ability to fly. These are examples from Greek antiquity. In the Genesis account, human beings, in a quest to be more than what they were made to be, transgress the boundaries set by God. Chaos, disaster, disorder, and ultimately death intrude. The garden of human flourishing is replaced by a wilderness of unremitting toil. The temptation to be transgressive is part of the human condition, but it seems particularly present in art and among artists. Let the church say amen. There is something thrilling, or maybe even necessary, about playing along the borders of convention for art to be made and for creativity to thrive. This sometimes turns subversive, as when the church musician subtly inserts a chord progression from a vulgar secular song into the gospel chorus, and then he and the other players exchange looks, thinking that no one has noticed what they have done. You think we don't know? We know. Theologically, I think there is something bordering on the prophetic in the impulse for the artist to tread these borderlands, because art potentially pierces the veil between the material and the spiritual realms in ways that may go beyond convention or tradition. Yet there is a difference between the disclosure of transcendent realities and the transgression of appropriate boundaries. And this is a real challenge in art and a real temptation for the artist. Indeed, transgression ruins the effect and ultimately destroys art. Provocation becomes pornographic. Graphic realism becomes gratuitous vulgarity. Transgression, both in theology and in art, is trespass and invites in forces that cannot easily be controlled. One prominent musician told me, if you give yourself completely to the art, it will carry you to places you do not want to go. And you will end up doing things that will not make your mother proud. As that thought lingers with you, let me turn my attention to the art of theology. If artists face the temptation to color outside the lines in defiance of convention and to transgress acceptable boundaries in pursuit of their artistic vision, theologians and pastors face the opposite temptation. For them, it is the temptation to define the lines as rigidly as possible and to enforce conformity with them in an innovating and suffocating way that kills creativity. In fact, it seems at times that the theological and pastoral ideal is to stay as far inside the lines as possible, to avoid anything that could possibly look like a transgression or be interpreted as a trespass. If artists are excused for being unconventional, perhaps even quirky, and they are even expected to be so, I can say it, my wife is an artist. Theologians are expected to be the opposite, because religion is based on some givens, unquestionable, incontrovertibles, that are often best seen in the context of sacred texts, religious writings, religious leaders, doctrine, canon, deity. This view of theology as the task of defining and refining the boundaries as clearly as possible is not simply the result of a rejectionist and conservative view of culture inherited from the missionary suspicion of traditional African culture, though that is part. More fundamentally, it flows from the accommodation of theology with the demands of the Enlightenment, which redefined the theological task. In medieval Europe, theology was recognized as the queen of both the arts and the sciences, based on the conviction that true knowledge of the revelation of God was foundational to every other human pursuit. Within this essentially primal worldview, there was a unity of vision, not unlike that present in traditional African culture as well. The Adinkra Jinyame, except God, is a profoundly symbolic representation of this ideal. God, and by implication, the knowledge of God, is foundational to all other knowledge. Rudolf Kukugezi finds a similar instantiation of knowledge in the title Nana, which is a term that is far deeper than its everyday use implies. The cultural and intellectual unity of vision of medieval European Christendom was upended First by the Reformation, then the Enlightenment. In the academy, human reason replaced divine revelation as the epistemological key to understanding reality. To be taken seriously in the academy as an intellectual discipline, the intuitive, the expressive, the supernatural, and the irrational components, or I should say non-rational components of human existence had to be bracketed out, dismissed, or explained away. For a time, the Theological Academy resisted this change, but ultimately succumbed and became less concerned with the whole universe of thought and more concerned with, as Andrew Walls put it, policing the frontier between the transcendent and the material realms of existence. Theology had to be understood and expressed as a science, and soon enough was relegated to the back corners of the academy and eventually replaced by the study of religion as a social science phenomenon. Now, if it is not obvious that I reject this view of theology, perhaps I should make it clear that I do. Though theological inquiry requires intellectual rigor and clarity of vision, the theological task is a scientific one in a way that many people, is not a scientific one in the way that many people understood that term. Theologians, and I may get in trouble here, but I know the exit. Theologians are descended from diviners, and divination is much more art than science. The theologian, like the diviner, deals with the transcendent and seeks to make sensible in human terms concepts and realities that are beyond human thought. Lest someone accuse me of heretical lyings by placing theologians and diviners in the same conceptual category, permit me to quote the Apostle Paul, who says to the Corinthian church, "We impart a secret and hidden wisdom of God." Then he continues, "The Spirit searches all things, even the depths of God. For who knows a person's thoughts except the spirit of that person, which is in him? So also no one comprehends the thoughts of God except the Spirit of God. Now we have received not the spirit of the world, but the Spirit who is from God, that we might understand things freely given to us by God. And we impart this, not in words taught by human wisdom, but taught by the Spirit, interpreting spiritual truths to those who are spiritual." Now, if this was not in the Bible, you would think I was quoting a pagan, quote, heathen diviner. Yes. The tools of our divination may be different than those used at the shrine. We usually work with libraries, commentaries, archives, rather than red oil, eggs, and white fowls. But there is no mistaking the similarity of the task. Our goals, too, are different. For the ultimate goal of theology is to impart the wisdom of God, to interpret the spiritual truths of God revealed through Jesus Christ. Yet, like the diviner, we are dealing with spiritual things that must be spiritually discerned. What we seek to express in Christian theology is spiritual wisdom, not human wisdom. And this means that it is a spiritual task requiring imagination, creativity, vulnerability, and discernment. In other words, it is an artistic endeavor and not merely a scientific or academic pursuit. These are the same things required of the artist, by the way, because art requires all of these. In this respect, we are more alike than we are different. And all of this is serious business. The title of this lecture is The Theology of Art and the Art of Theology, Reflections on Christian Creativity. And I've talked about the first two, and I shall now attempt to bring together some threads of my previous thought to reflect on what I mean by Christian creativity. In my estimation, creativity is linked to our being as creatures made in the image and likeness of God. And so whether in the artistic or theological task, creativity is key. That is, I see the work of both Christian artists and Christian theologians linked together by a common need for creativity. But what does that mean in practical terms for Christians engaged in theology or the arts, and particularly in relation to the theme of this symposium. Here, I would beg your indulgence to be a bit more speculative and, dare I say, intuitive. My thoughts are not fully formed. The word that comes to mind in relation to this question of practicality is perhaps a surprising one, and that is the word play, P-L-A-Y, play. Play is not a word one usually thinks of in reference to theology. Given the seriousness of religion, there is presumably little room for humor, little space for play. And indeed, it may appear that the very purpose of religion is to bring an end to play, to detest play, and to hold forth a solid truth. Religion is serious business, and play is for children, not theologians or reverend ministers. Indeed, play is not for any serious person, unless one is talking about stage play or commercial film, which are very serious and very big businesses. Still, I propose there is a connection between art making or performance, theological reflection, and the kind of play that all of us engaged in as children. Now, let me be clear. I'm not suggesting anything like childishness on the part of artists, so don't stone me. I'm not being dismissive of the work of performance or art making. What I am pointing out that each of these endeavors, properly understood, are embodied tasks about which one must have a certain lack of self-consciousness to engage. One must free oneself from the constraints either adopted or imposed so that one may freely enter into what the artistry requires. To play, one must be free. That is, one must be willing to set aside emotional and physical reserve. This may be why, last year the question was asked, why is it hard to get the men to participate in the dramas at churches? Well, it seems that the Pauline mantra, when I became a man, I put away childish things, has been taken too much to heart by the men's fellowship. When I say that art making is embodied, this is not difficult to grasp for our artists here. This is less so with theological reflection because we have understood it as a purely cognitive and conceptual exercise, forgetting that the heart of theology is spirituality, and it is inseparable from emotion, feeling, values, qualities, expectations, associations, even if they cannot be articulated in the higher sense of conceptual meaning. The meaning attached to ritual, and I'm talking to my theological students here, the meaning attached to ritual, the beliefs we hold, the doctrines we espouse, are not disembodied and therefore must be engaged with in the same way that an actor engages a film role or an artist engages the medium of art. Theology must be played or acted or danced or painted, just as it must be thought and written. Christian creativity requires a willingness to play, and this is not a diminishment, but it is an enlargement of our tasks as both artists and theologian, because it demands a more comprehensive understanding of our identity as those made in the image of God for creative flourishing. Let me be clear also that Christian creativity, what I am calling play, does not in any way diminish the call for rigor in our scholarly or professional pursuits. Indeed, it is only when one has done the difficult task of mastering the fundamentals of one's craft that one is truly free to play. Just as the concert pianist must first master the do, re, mi, so too the New Testament scholar must know his alpha, beta, gamma, delta. So if I say we are playing, it is not child's play. Since I have mentioned children, and Christ said we must become as little children to enter the kingdom, permit me to illustrate my point by using children as an example. When small children play, whether drawing or dancing or play acting, they are fully immersed in their imaginative world. They embody fully whatever they imagine themselves to be, and yet they are also quite serious. If you've ever seen children play, They don't joke with their play. Children, and I'm thinking of myself when I was a small boy playing with my brother and my cousins, may spend hours crafting costumes, characters, stories, along with determining the rules of their imaginative universe. And sometimes arguments break out because someone has broken the rules. This one is lava. He stepped on it. This is where the baby is supposed to sleep. Don't move the baby from that place. This is the color that must be used. As observers, we may dismiss these things, but anyone who has spent time with small children knows that it's serious business when children play. And yet, for all the seriousness exhibited by children at play, what they do not take seriously is themselves. The child is free to slay dragons because the real terrors of the world are kept at bay by the security of parents who love and care for them. The child may paint wild pictures and dance wild dances because they are unafraid of being rejected. And they are unafraid because they are safely bound by the structures of their parents' love and care. In the same way, Christian creativity is free to play, to innovate, to stretch the imagination when it remains within the boundaries set for us by God. I have said a lot, perhaps too much, or maybe too little, I don't know. I have been, as I said, speculative and not definitive in my claims. Permit me to end by returning to the beginning, to the origination of this symposium and Prof. Larry's response to my lecture those few years ago. I do not recall all of what Prof. Larry said, but I do recall the cheerful, or dare I say, playful spark of interest in his eyes. It was a spark of excitement and wonder. It's a spark I've seen before in the eyes of works of great scholars and artists, like the late Professor Andrew Walls, who, despite their age and experience and many publications, never lost their sense of childlike wonder, creativity, and playfulness. It is the spark of playful creativity that takes seriously the work, but not the self, because the self has been freed to play in the garden of God. Thank you very much.
I don't think I need to go and stand behind that podium, so I will just stay right here. Well, I mean, I don't know what to say. I'm very thrilled. I like ideas, and I like being speculative. I like thinking, and so there's a lot of thought in that paper that I am chuckling about inside my mind. So I'm very grateful for it. And what's even more amazing, we're on time. We have quite a bit of time for discussion. Of course, one of the things that I keep thinking about is the role of play. I always think of God as playing with us. Not in some kind of cruel sense, but in the way that which parents play with their children and allow them to play back with the parent. I have a friend, an artist, who always says that as human beings, we are a species of children, and God is the master parent. So this whole idea of play is really tickling me a lot, and I hope that we can engage it thoroughly and step outside a little bit, push the boundaries a little bit. Now, I know we're talking about creativity and being an artist and what it takes as theologians to be artists, artists to be theologians, being creative. But I also don't want us to forget a big part about being creative is being visionary. You can be creative and not be visionary. And maybe we can touch upon that in the discussion that's coming up. Anyway, I want to thank Dr. Settles for a very engaging talk. The breadth of it, the interesting ideas, There's some things that when you were speaking, I thought, oh, I wish he'd say that again. we need an emphasis right here. We need an emphasis there. So hopefully we can go back to some of those things that he mentioned. I hope you have much to say to him to engage the ideas that he shared with us. So I'd like to open this time up for our discussion, engaging the paper, engaging our brother and colleagues, and see how we can push this and how we can all, in pushing, have that same spark in our own eyes of play and innovation. So the floor is open for discussion on this very brilliant talk. Thank you so much. Questions, ideas, comments, points of clarification, dance, a poem, a revelation, a prophetic word. Thank you, our brother.
They're using it to go around. Let me shoot.
Thank you so much, Joshua, for the presentation. Very, very riveting. Just as you were presenting, talking about play, I don't know if you're aware of this, the word agro cuts across the arts in our local language. So if someone is dancing, ogro. If someone is acting, it's also agro. So I'm not sure if you're aware of this, but in our local languages, play underlines the arts. So thank you so much for that.
The mic was handed over to me, so I have to force myself and talk. I was not ready though. It was handed over. So please then allow me to ask or chip this in. As you mentioned the theology and the arts, you mentioned the play, you mentioned music, of course, and from the beginning, dance was mentioned somewhere. So I'm asking, recently, as you mentioned, that there was one bishop that mentioned that he would not pay his musicians, and we were all laughing and all. So what do you think about churches that go strictly according to the rules of the Bible, which may not speak to arts and theology? I'm asking because one reverend minister mentioned to me that it's in the Bible that osempakafo be didi na asem ho, but one can say ojumtuni be didi nyujum. So so he was trying to say that we in the arts try to always defend why we must be valued through metaphor, but it is not strictly, or it's not straight in the Bible. And that is how come, for them, he believes reverend ministers must be paid. There are many quotations in the Bible, but for musicians to be valued or to be paid, it is difficult to find that in the Bible. So what do you take, what's your take about it in terms of this? Thank you.
Should I respond? I think I don't know the full context in which he said that, so I will not straightforwardly disagree. But I would draw attention to what the Bible says about the Levites, the Levitical priesthood, which was set apart by God to serve the ritual functions in the Old Testament. And that was quite an expansive group. The priests were drawn from the Levitical class, those who were doing the sacrifices and all of that. But there were also musicians who were drawn from that class. And they were supported by the larger community. They didn't have their own inheritance in the land. The Bible says, because God himself is their inheritance. And so, by implication, all of those who were devoted to the service of the temple and to the tabernacle and the temple were supported by the community through their giving. The tithes did not just go to the people who were cutting up the animal. They went to the whole support of all the Levitical priesthood, which included musicians, by implication, other artists. I think the difficulty comes because when you come to the New Testament has a very, very little actually to say directly about how worship should be conducted. It doesn't say a lot about it. And that's because of what the New Testament is. The New Testament is the Gospels. It tells about the life and ministry of Jesus, the early ministry of the apostles, and then a lot of letters written to churches who were having problems. And so those letters were not necessarily intended to address every possible thing. They were dealing with particular issues. So if the issue didn't come up, the apostle may not have written about it. After all, Paul was too busy writing about the man who was having an affair with his father's wife to be concerned about the musicians in the church and if they should be paid. There were weightier matters, I think, in his mind. But generally, as a general principle, I think that's scriptural. The Bible people are here. I am a historian. But in principle, I believe that our service to God, whether in theology or what we call clerical ministry or art or whatever, is service. It should come from the heart. It's not done from a mercenary motive. We don't do it because we are looking to get paid. But we ought to be supported because what we are doing is unto the Lord, if that makes sense. So you don't go into ministry because you're looking for a paycheck. At least you shouldn't, in my view. That's a wrong motive. And if you are going into arts ministry just because you are looking for a paycheck, I would say you also have a wrong motive, you see. At the same time, I don't think you should be penalized because your gifting is playing the keyboard and not preaching behind a pulpit. As we all have various gifts, let us use them to build the body of Christ. That's my view.
If I could say, you said something about metaphor.
He was saying that the musicians use metaphorical language to justify why they should be paid. And the Bible is very straightforward to say the pastors should be paid. That's what he was pointing out. Yes.
Any other questions, comments? Hey, Dr. Gazy, I saw your hand first. Okay.
Dr. Baji. Yes. I've been asked to come and stand in front so that the camera can capture me. Yeah, that was a paper and a half, if not two. Very, very interesting points you have raised. And I don't know if it's a question or a contribution, maybe more a contribution than a question, which is that as you were talking, you've touched on some of the things I'm going to say already. That in the olden days or in the Old Testament, when God appointed the spiritual leaders, he also called the Levites. And the Levites don't work. And the Levites are supported by the community. Okay. So now, this thing about there's hardly any religious observance without art. There's hardly any religious observance without art. If you do that, your congregation will sleep on you. There will be a severe disconnect. And so if the preacher is going to have to nibble on the word, I don't see why not that the artists that are propelling that work will hakum koyo, aka will be drinking air. That will not be appropriate, won't you say? I think that will not be ethical. So that, praise the Lord, oh. Even though I am not saying that we should enter there with the motive of looking at the money, that is not it. But then, the support is also necessary. It is. So that people can even come and continue contributing to the work of God. Hallelujah.
Amen.
Dr. Gazy?
Thank you very much, Dr. Settles. I think I also join Dr. Ingrid in reminding us of the playfulness that we all need. And I'm also wondering, whether, and I think you did touch a bit on it. I don't know if you have further thoughts on it. That we lose our childlikeness as we grow, and so we are afraid to play. But I also like the point you made about the self being freed in our as Christians, in our encounter with the Lord. So those are the things I pick, and I thought, if since you are question and answer, if you have some further thoughts on it, how do we, or how should we be conscious of our freed self that enabled us to, play? And all the examples and I wish Prof. Lai would have commented on whether your description of how he felt, the playfulness in his eyes, yeah. And I like the children, because we all have younger children at home. Sometimes we feel it's a nuisance with what they are doing, but like the point you made, they are immersed, but also not too serious. But I thought if you could, and maybe the comment on the Levites and co, just a point, that is also true. I agree with that. And I think that maybe the nomenclature, how we name them, rather than musicians, they are also ministers. They are workers, and there are a lot of assumptions also in the New Testament, as you rightly noted. The synagogues and the church developed with that assumption of what entailed in the temple. So even though in New Testament we don't have specific descriptions of how the churches were, we have the Old Testament, and as you rightly connected, the ministers, the church, the new Israel, the same understanding. And if Paul will talk about, use an example in the Old Testament to justify why, even though he's not asking for them to reward him, you have to reward. But he was falling on the Old Testament understanding. So we shouldn't be quick to cut off the Old Testament. It's God's own idea of calling the Levites, calling the priest, and there's a pedagogy on that I thought we could also highlight. Thank you.
I'm not the chairman, so I'll let the chairperson decide who speaks first or when I should answer.
Could you address Dr. Gazy's comment?
Oh, is yours related?
I wanted to piggyback on that, on the playfulness of children. I observed my own children growing up, and they really love to play and even be in front of guests until they started their teenage. Once puberty setting, they became more self-conscious. So I really like that idea of being free. Yes. The freedom enables you to play. And I recall my first year here as a student, one of the things that our acting technique class sought to do was to free us. Yes. Because once you're so self-conscious, you can't really perform. So I think that's a very essential thing. And when we think about, now I'm an artist thinking about theology, Christ came to set us free. So yeah, just a thought.
Thank you for that, Prof, because I was going to start from that end. I think it's a principle we see in art performance. I'm not professionally into art performance, but if I even take preaching or singing in church, you have to get past your self-consciousness to do it well. Because if you are it's like if you overthink what you are doing, you end up stumbling. And so I had a conversation with the musicians in my church, some of the choristers, and I said, you all don't know the words of the song well enough to enjoy singing it. You are so conscious to make sure you don't mess up the words that there's no flow. It can't, I say, but when you have practice and you know the thing so well, then you can have fun with it. You can improvise, you can play with your notes, you can do all kinds of things. But when you are so conscious of how you look, how I'm standing, am I doing it? Then you can't really, and I think as we grow up and we get criticism and we are told how to behave, and those things naturally make you feel like, I can't do that again, But I believe that, and there's a place for that, deportment and so on, sure. But the heart wants to play. And there's a place for freedom of expression that I think sometimes and particularly more so for men than women often, is almost beat out of you. It's like, don't be too happy. Don't smile too much. I mean, you can't look too exuberant. And so we have a whole, setup where the only time, and I say about men, the only time sometimes you see men being expressive is if they're watching football. That's the only time they look like they are excited about anything. They can't be excited in church. They can't cry at the funeral. It's like, what is wrong with it? It's not healthy. It's not healthy. Because Christ has said we should be free. And I think the freedom comes, in Christian terms, from knowing you are secure and loved. Why teenagers tend to do that is because they are finding themselves their way in the world. And they are not sure they will be accepted. So they are always overly conscious of what other people think. But the idea, I think, in Christianity that is mirrored in the arts is you have to, in a way, get over what people think so that you can actually be free to embody what it is you are embodying. That is my bit on that. Rudolph, you asked about something else. That was it. Okay. Yeah. Exactly.
So my question really picks up on what the gentleman said previously about the pastor not wanting to pay his musicians. And it got me thinking about what I think it's a core problem. Why is it that, so it's a question I'm just throwing out there. So why is it that creative work or work in the arts, it's not considered work? It's not considered seriously as work. So to use an example, if within a church setting, not specific to the example that you gave, but generally, if we had a church member who was a contractor and he had to fix the roof of the church, I don't think anybody is going to bat an eyelid when he presents a bill for that work. And he may be a church member. Mm-hmm. So it got me thinking, what is behind that unwillingness to see the work of an artist, and I use the word artist broadly, as work? So that's my question.
My question has to do with as Christians, in the quest of becoming a good artist in this current generation or dispensation, what should we do? Because I remember in one of my classes, I was teaching one of our traditional dances, Akom. Then one student came to me, Miss D, this dance, I'm scared to do it because of my background. I'm a Christian and it's more of a religious dance. So when I'm performing it, I feel fetish. I'm like, you are here to do it, so forget about that Christian background and then do what you're supposed to do as a student in a class. So my question is, what can we do as Christians to become good artists? Thank you.
Thank you very much for the opportunity. You mentioned that when God did the creation, it was not as though, there wasn't anything, out of which God created things. And so you created that image that even before they were human beings, they were chaos, but God, the master creator, bounded that. And you said that this order wasn't disbanded, but it was bounded. To say that there was danger, but God, in his own wisdom, had bounded that and then created a very good garden where human beings had been placed. The question I ask is, was there disorder before the Garden of Eden, or the transgression actually brought the disorder that we would have to grapple with? I mean, I wasn't too...
Okay, let me try to handle the three questions. my view, and in terms of why, I think there are complex reasons why art is not considered work. I don't have the full answer. One reason I suspect is because the things we consider as arts are things that everybody can do to some extent in the minds of people. So it's not valued in the same way. I don't know how to build a building. I mean, it's a specialized skill, but I can get up and try to sing. So it's not seen in the same specialist category. And so people don't see the work that goes into a very good performance sometimes. So they tend to devalue it. That is one reason, I think. I don't think it's the only reason, but I think it's one of the reasons. Because, all kinds of people can sing. And we can get the Women's Fellowship to do a dance. It doesn't, and it's seen as play. Like, this is something that children can come and do. So it's not attached in a monetary sense in people's mind. It doesn't have a monetary value. Part of that is, I think, there's an over-commercialization in our society, generally, where we think the only things that are valuable are things that are attached to money. And we devalue every other thing. Will this fetch you money? So that's part of it. I don't think it's the full answer, but I think it's part of it. Yes, please.
In our African context also, art is so ubiquitous. It's everywhere. It's all around us. And when you have something in abundance, you tend to take it for granted.
Yes.
So you see that traditional artists are not paid.
Mm-hmm.
People performing in the village square, people come by and drop coins. Nobody pays them. So an artist, even in our traditional context, is not considered somebody who should be paid. I mean, paid as in a paycheck.
Mm.
You may get some coins dropping from here. So I think it's even in our traditional context, and it's all because, and then there's also this notion, I think that's what you hit on, that the performer audience distinction is so blurred in our context. Somebody can be telling a story, and then somebody in the audience says, I was there, and takes over from the person. So what's so special about the storyteller? Those who are listening can also tell the story. So there's so I agree with you in that sense. So the ubiquity of the art forms around us make us take it for granted. But I think that as we progress, we need to be thinking more about the fact that artists must eat as well.
It's also that they're not professional.
Yes.
Yeah.
It's not a professional occupation. And I think that's the key thing. Sorry, I think it's that the artists are not considered professionals. There's no professionalization of art. And I think that's what makes it appear as if there is not something that should be compensated. You shouldn't be rewarded for your particular skill and professionalization. I think that's a big part of it.
I'm thinking that the idea that the arts should not be paid is cultural specific. And as I sat here, I was just going through my mind when I was a student in the US. I attended a church and I was a Sunday school teacher. So in Ghana, I was a Sunday school teacher. Nobody paid me for that. And then in the US, at the end of the month, I was handed an envelope, and I said, yeah. Well, I don't know. That's the church I attended. Yeah. Yeah, no, it's not a black church. It's not a black, it's a Methodist church. Well, so I'm talking from my experience as a Sunday school teacher in a Methodist church in Pennsylvania. So I was, and then I was surprised because I said, well, this is my service to God. I don't understand why I should be paid for that. And the pastor said, well, all the Sunday school teachers are paid because they are also using their time teaching the kids. So I think that here in Ghana, what I see in what the pastor said the other time was the fact that the arts are seen as gift their God-given talent, and as such they should not be remunerated. But we should also know that these days that is the job that people. That's a job, and it's a bread and butter issue.
Thank you. Let me just continue from there. If we talk, we no go finish. I want to speak to this issue of what should we do as Christians when you are called to engage in what traditionally is considered a religious form. That's a very critical issue, and it's a serious one. So I don't take it for granted, because spirituality is a very real thing, and the associations that people have, even, let me say it this way, even if the thing is not real, okay, I will not say the thing is not real, but even if it were not real, the belief of the person that it is real will cause an issue for the person. All right? So that is one. Two, I think it is, in my view, an error that in the academy we want people to set aside their most fundamental identificational realities. I cannot stop being a Christian because I'm learning dance. To be asked to do that is like dividing my soul. So that is what the person is wrestling with. They will feel like you are asking me almost to, as it were, blaspheme in their mind. You may not see it that way, but to them, it feels like you are asking them to blaspheme. It would be almost like asking a Muslim to denounce the Quran or Allah. They couldn't, no matter what you do, they won't do it. If you have to fail them out of school, they will take their failure and go, because they cannot do something so fundamental to their identity. So I think sometimes when we cast it in terms of another religion, we understand it better. So what we then have to do is, okay, how do I help this person as a Christian to navigate learning something that in the person's mind is unchristian or could expose her to spiritual harm? I think that's where the secular academy has a lot of problems, because they can't officially do anything. Right? You can't take, if it were Akrofi-Christaller, we'd take you to the corner, we may bring some oil, we may lay some hands, we may blow some tongues, and then we'll proceed with the thing. I'm not sure you are permitted to do that in the School of Performing Arts. You see, but that is the challenge. So I think there are ways that these kinds of collaborations can sometimes help us to think through, okay, are there workshops we can do? Are there trainings we can do to help lecturers and even students know how to engage these things? Are there chaplains that can help students pray through the issues so that they can, in good conscience, learn what they need to learn without it feeling like it is a violation of their personal belief system and integrity? And that is something I think the university would not want a person to feel as if their personhood is being violated. That would go contrary to, human rights, right? So I shouldn't have to violate my conscience to learn an art. Ultimately, that is the issue. So I think there would need to be conversations held about how do we help people honor their tradition, their religious tradition and beliefs, and yet still learn the necessary skills to appreciate the art form as art form. So that is the little I can say about that. I think the School of Performing Arts, maybe you have some workshops you need to continue to think about in relation to that. Now, my brother asked a question. You were asking about clarification related to disorder and chaos. Was it there before the fall of humanity? You will note in the first chapter of Genesis, it gives a particular account of the creation. And that's when I was emphasizing that you see the sea itself is a symbol in that cultural context of chaos. It is not eliminated, it is bordered, it is bounded. The seas above, the seas below, the ocean, they are bounded. So in that sense, it is always present as part of creation, all right? Theologically speaking, what we could say is that when humanity sinned, They transgressed the boundary that was set, and in so doing, broke the boundaries that had kept chaos and disorder at bay and invited it in. But it was already present in the creation. God has a way of handling these things that humans cannot. That's, in my view, the whole issue of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. God can touch evil and not be destroyed by it. We cannot. You see the difference. God touches evil. Evil is eliminated. We touch evil, we are destroyed. That's why God was very careful. Don't touch the tree. Don't touch it. And then the man went and added to all these other things and told the woman, and she got confused, and there was a whole lot of palaver. And we are still living with it to this day. The man blamed the woman blamed the snake had nobody to blame.
We have 4 minutes left before we go on our tea break. So, are there any hands raised for questions or comments? Okay, we will hear from this sister, and then the other questions you will engage over tea.
Okay, thank you for giving me this time. So I'm a practicing artist, and I've been working since 2013 as an artist. And going back to the idea of artists should get paid. I've lived in different countries, Black communities. I've lived in Haiti, Black America, Togo, and here. And it's always the same. People always come to us and say, you don't kind of deserve to get paid because it's ubiquitous, anybody can do it. But that's not true. Like, many of us were trained. We spent many years developing ourselves, developing the skills. It's no longer talent. We're beyond that. We're at the skillful level. I remember when I was in Haiti working as an artist, some people would tell me, oh, you're not really an artist because you get paid. And I was so shocked by that. Now, I'll tell you this, I did go to business school and get me a master's in business because I realized that the reason why it was so hard for me as an artist in the beginning is because I didn't understand how money worked. When we give students art education, we don't tell them the realities of, well, one day you're gonna have to eat. And it was in business school that I learned that, and I did not feel at home in business school. I didn't feel at home, I was not with my people. But it's because I have an MBA that I'm able to be an artist who can work. And so when I hear people say that, oh, well, when you go to church and you're doing it for the love of God, yes, I am, but like everybody else says, we need to eat. Thank you.
Let me just comment briefly. So they don't also get paid. So if you have somebody who's going and hustling and they have to work and go preach on Sunday, and then you, the musician, want to come and get paid, the person is going to look at you with their eyes some way and say, me who had to loan the church money to pay the electric bill last month, and you want to take money. Because that's the reality for a lot of churches. So sometimes because we see certain churches or denominations that are, as they will say, they are dusted, and they have the capacity because of income to support people in these ways, we think it is a norm. But it's actually not as common. Churches often are struggling financially, but it's not evident sometimes because of, as Auntie Sarah said, the performance elements, and it looks like everything is going well. So I think, again, whether you are in what we call professional clerical ministry, or you are in ministry of music or arts or whatever, our ministry is supposed to be service unto God. That is supposed to be our motivation. We use our gifts in the body, and we work at it. And sometimes we will get compensated for it financially. Sometimes, and a lot of times, they had some small celebration, they brought some foodstuffs and some small offering. I say, hey, this offering they are giving, this money they are giving, in compensation for all the people who have come to the house and he sorted them and did, it doesn't even add up. But he did it because of love of God. And I grew up in a church where all my family members, we were all in a church, we all did music. My brother played the drums. He never got a pesewa or a penny for playing drums in the church all his years. He was a very good drummer, So I think we have to be guided in these discussions to make sure our motives are right. Let me say this last thing, and I think it's very critical. Those who go into clerical ministry, and it touches on what I said, are trained, prepped for it. We are given orientation. But we tend not to do that with people who are going into other types of ministries. And so one of the very dangerous things in the church is we have a lot of musicians who are not discipled. They are spiritually immature, but musically gifted. And my brothers and sisters, they can wreck your church because they are very talented. I told my choir people the last time I had a meeting with them, I said, I had this musician I worked with. The man, he was a gospel choir musician. He was bad on the bass. I mean, the man could play the bass like you wouldn't believe. And I remember he came to concert to play. He was high. I know he was high. But the way he could play, you see the realities. And he's a gospel musician, gospel choir, because he played at the club on the night before because he needed to get his money. The choir wasn't giving him his money. So we need to be guided in these things. And the boundaries God has set for us is what is supposed to guide our deliberations and our thinking as Christians. Thank you very much.